Dit programma is mede mogelijk gemaakt door Bundel, ITAR Innovative Technology, RealRoot Supplements, ProPrivacy, Goud 999 en MVO 2026. Prepare today.
I was told to shut up, be quiet. I mean, it was unbelievable.
The United States is set to officially exit the World Health Organization.
One thing I really agree with Donald Trump is the WHO is not fit for purpose. It should be completely disbanded. It's completely, utterly incompetent. Nobody called it turbo cancer before. It's just that when you see so many of them and you're dealing with a clear situation, they coined the term turbo because as I said, there was something driving this. We knew it was dangerous right from the very start. What we didn't understand was that they would go ahead with making a vaccine based on the spike protein. And another person said to me, one of my colleagues, "Stop pointing this out. You're upsetting my patients." I said, "What do you not understand? I'm trying to stop you killing them." I mean, it's that simple. How can you respond to some stupid thing like that? Well, it's been shown to be absolutely correct.
Why are people not yet arrested for what has been going on? Because this is serious.
It is unbelievably serious. I mean, nothing could be... These people are unbelievably stupid, or they were driven by a higher force, which I call evil.
Water and wind collide while the lighthouse keeps its quiet watch. A fragile balance returns once the storm has finished what it came to do. Overwhelming, ever-changing, a new horizon appears. And still, unaware as we are, we find ourselves searching again for that one thing, what is true.
Wonderful to have you here, Angus, all the way from London. And this program, you might not know, is some sort of format that I use to unravel the unbelievable complex world that we're living in. And I hope we'll find some answers today for the questions that I have. But first of all, maybe you can explain to the people who are watching, who is Angus Dalglish?
Okay, well, as you said, I have been a professor of oncology at the University of London. In fact, I was the foundation professor of oncology at the University of London and placed at St George's Hospital Medical School, as it was then. And I also had honorary consultant medical oncology with the hospital, where I really took up the role of looking at immunotherapy a long time ago, the very early 90s, when it was regarded so unfashionable nobody would give me a grant. But fortunately, I had some early success and patients gathered round and funded my work. And I'm delighted to say that vision has paid off. It really is the main way of managing, certainly melanoma, which was my field at the time, but now it's spread out into several other cancers. I previously had a role in HIV. I was better known for HIV before I took the professorship, because I worked with Robin Weiss at the Institute of Cancer Research, and I was known best for discovering CD4 as the HIV receptor, and I spent quite a long time working out why the vaccines for HIV would not work, and I believe we discovered that, and with colleagues in Norway, Børge Sørensen and colleagues, we have had a very good vaccine candidate. So I had the background to understand what vaccines are about, what they can do and what they can't do. And what's going to be relevant to the discussion today, I've been on many boards, scientific boards, so all the major pharmas at some stage because of the big rush into making products for HIV. And also with regards to vaccines. And I get criticized for a lot of what I say and what I'm going to do, because I've been brushed aside as just a clinician who doesn't know anything about vaccines or immunology. Well, I know a darn sight more than most of my peers, and I learnt all I needed to understand about messenger RNA from being on the scientific board of a company that called itself the Messenger RNA Vaccine Company. I left that 8 years ago, and I was on it for 5 years. And I had the insight that there was not the technology to make these things safe. And I don't believe anything's changed since then.
When did you discover or found out that the recent produced mRNA vaccines or injections, because I'm going to ask you later if we should call it a vaccine or not, but when did you find out that they were unsafe and ineffective? Because that's what you stated.
Right from the beginning. And by the way, that if we defer to calling them vaccines, but several colleagues and I feel we should call them vax-genes as opposed to vaccines.
Because it's gene therapy?
Because it's gene therapy. It's not vaccines at all. So when did I discover that they were potentially dangerous? Well, the first thing was, as soon as the sequence was released by Nature, I was working with an HIV vaccine with Børge Sørensen in Norway, and it actually worked. I mean, he called it sort of Vax4X, and I got involved in making it a bit better, and I believe it's as good as you're ever going to get now. But interestingly, for those who cry out that it's the most important thing to do, they took no notice of it. But that's another thing. But when we saw the sequence, Børge called me and said, let's make a vaccine along the same lines that works for HIV. And that is, you pick 4 or 5 core sequences that if you take them out with a vaccine, the virus cannot exist. Whereas the previous approach was to use the whole envelope for HIV, which has 3,000 antigens, confuses the system, and essentially you'd have to be, I think, incredibly naive and devoid of any significant history of vaccinology or immunology to think that's ever going to work. Well, into that arena steps Tony Fauci, who in 1984 said we would have an HIV vaccine based on the envelope in 18 months. Well, we did, but it didn't work. And 40 years later, after many, many attempts, it has not worked. So we thought the immediate thing to do for the coronavirus vaccine was to select 4 or 5 core features. And when we were looking for those in detail, it became obvious that we should never use the spike protein. And the spike protein was really the equivalent of the envelope of HIV. And this spike protein, when we looked at it carefully, it had 6 inserts, highly positively charged inserts, which should not have been there. And so the only conclusion is they'd been inserted with Ralph Barrick technology from America by Wuhan, and any idea that they could defend this was ludicrous because they had already published a couple of efforts to do these inserts in major journals. So to pretend that it wasn't from the lab was completely ludicrous. But there was this massive psyop that we weren't allowed to discuss it. I got messages from on high in the university. You are not allowed to discuss the origins of the virus.
Talking about the lab leak resulted by gain-of-function research.
Absolutely. So this is so important because of the discovery of these positive charge, we knew that it would be a very bad thing to make a vaccine of. So Børge arranged for blast analysis of the spike protein, which is a very sophisticated mechanism to see if you did use the spike protein, how would it be seen by the immune system? Result, 79% of the spike protein is very homologous to human epitopes. It would be a disaster. It would cause every autoimmune disease under the sun, which it has done. And we warned, we had contacts, personal contacts who knew Michael Gove and people in the cabinet, and we passed all this on.
That's in the UK, yeah?
In the UK. We wrote a document pointing all this out, saying it was all this. It went to Michael Gove, the cabinet, Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty, who they decided in their brilliance to say that there was no evidence that anything I said was of any substance at all. And now everything that we did say has been shown to be correct. They refused to engage, refused to talk to high-level people like Richard Dearlove, who was in the MI6, and actually defended me because he got people to check what I said out and came to the conclusion that I was likely to be more correct than any of the authorities like the MRC or the Wellcome Trust or the NIH, which was really quite an endorsement. But now he's convinced that we were 100% correct. Vallance and Co. will not talk to them. There's been several attempts by the major newspapers to do so. So at any rate, with answer to your question, we knew it was dangerous right from the very start. So this is the first part. What we didn't understand was that they would go ahead with making a vaccine based on the spike protein. And when they did, we warned them, and this is messenger RNA aside, this is any vaccine. And of course, they were going with AstraZeneca, which is a British company working with Oxford, University of Oxford, and a vaccine institute, which is based there, who'd been obsessed with making vaccines using an adenoviral vector from a chimpanzee as an ideal vaccine. So once again, people were opportunists without thinking. They didn't think. We've got a technology, it's not been much use for it before, now we'll go on the world stage. And what did they do? They put the spike protein in it. And then that's when we went even more ballistic and saying, this is the last thing you should put in, because we know that the spike protein binds a receptor called the ACE2 receptor. And that's, we have to sort of mention that bit of detail, because that ACE2 receptor is basically the commander of the cardiovascular orchestra. It's highly expressed in the heart, controls blood pressure, controls heart rate, everything. If you do a vaccine based on this with the antibodies to this, you will create mayhem and all sorts of cardiological damage. And we said, do not do this. There will be heart attacks, strokes, myocarditis. And then we looked at our homology and found that antibodies to some of these homologies would induce serious thrombotic and clotting syndromes. And sure enough, every single one of these has happened. But it was worse than that. Because these inserts were so positively charged, they went beyond the ACE receptor. So this thing could bind receptors that previously didn't sort of exist for such a coronavirus spike. And some of these were very interesting and very important, and they included receptors to blunt the innate immune response. So to have a vaccine that helps switch off the innate immune response is beyond stupidity. I mean, it should have scrapped it there and then. And these receptors are also involved in smell and taste. Does that ring a bell about the coronavirus, that it took out taste and smell? So we knew clinically that these observations and predictions were all correct. So it was very interesting that the AstraZeneca, and we get into other areas here, the AstraZeneca vaccine, and that was a vaccine because it was not based on messenger RNA. It's the one thing we should bear in mind. It caused problems, cardiovascular problems, particularly as they rolled it out into younger people. Palpitations. My son and two of his friends had these issues, and we know they cause now myocarditis, heart attacks.
Your son was injected with AstraZeneca?
I didn't know, but he had the AstraZeneca vaccine because it was pushed on him for his work and everything.
He lives in Australia.
Which is a crime. He lives in Australia. And he had the first before he went there, but then he had to have it again. I mean, but he told me of friends of his who'd all had hyperpalpitations, anaphylactic shock. I mean, immediately I was accused of saying it was a good idea in theory if they had overcome these problems. And I was led to believe they'd overcome these problems. They'd listened, but they hadn't. They basically lied. Of these, in the UK, we have a yellow card system. So doctors can report to the MHRA, which is meant to be the regulatory authority. And this is an authority that says, if you have a dozen yellow cards, we will look into this product and withdraw it until we're satisfied it's safe.
It's like a safety agency.
Issue. They had, listen to this, 46,000 yellow cards. of the dangers of the AstraZeneca, and they still didn't withdraw it. If that isn't extreme medical negligence and criminal negligence, I would argue, I'd like to know what is. AstraZeneca was never withdrawn the approval. The company had enough sense to realize it's going to do them unbelievable institutional reputational damage. They withdrew it silently as if it was never been on the market. So into that area comes forth the messenger RNA vaccines, which is the Pfizer and the Moderna, and they took up all the slack. And that is where the real damage started. So I guess I want to really point out we've already discussed two bits of this. The first is the spike protein had so many features of it, it shouldn't even have been considered as a vaccine formula. The fact that 150 people, organizations selected it for their vaccine, universities, institutes and companies, suggests that nobody there had a brain to think about the consequences.
A lack of knowledge, maybe.
Well, I can't believe they didn't have the knowledge. They had a total lack of scientific curiosity. And I mean, the first thing I would say is, if I do this, that and the other, what are the consequences? It seemed that nobody thought that through. And the second thing was that the AstraZeneca one, that when they did push it in, gave us the artificial feeling that it was actually safe. They'd tested it, and very shortly afterwards it was clear not. And that's when I went against all the vaccines, because I'd realized that no way could they have corrected the deficiencies that we had pointed out. But when the messenger RNA vaccine started rolling out, that is when we started to see all sorts of damage. And we know retrospectively they knew that.
And you're still a physician. You work in a clinic.
Yes.
Have you seen an increase of people with all these problems that you addressing?
Yes, thank you for asking that question, that I work in a clinic. Have I seen these things? I do not need to go to the clinic to see them. I see it in friends and colleagues, community, clubs, etc. It is unbelievable the number of people who have had amazing damage from these vaccines. The cardiac ones, severe loss of control of atrial fibrillation, runs of tachycardia that are very inconvenient because you don't need that output. They lost control of the cardiovascular with several deaths. Strokes. I know 2 or 3 people personally who had tremendous strokes after the vaccine. We now know this is, not uncommon. And then the other thing is that it was seen is this autoimmunity. Remember I said that the homology of the spike protein is 79%, let's call that 80% of the spike protein cross-reacts with the human epitopes. I warned that this will cause every autoimmune disease under the sun. Well, it has. The VAERS data on the Pfizer vaccine, which the FDA have, my colleague Paul Marrick, who's looked at it in great detail, said there's 131 autoimmune diseases being registered as being inflicted by the vaccinations. And that is about every single one that is that are in the medical textbooks or recognized immune diseases.
They all occurred.
They all occur. And of course, because there's 131 all occurring, then they can say, well, they're very rare. But if you add them up, they're really common. And a couple of friends of mine have had the vaccine and then developed extreme vasculitis, arthritis. Who were completely well before, really well. And now, one of them particularly is dependent on having injections every week and steroids just to remain mobile. Now, think of that. The vaccines are rolled out, to save us from this pandemic. We've got loads of people who've been, 1, killed, made completely disabled, and I know people who've been completely disabled. They've got a kind of long COVID, a fatigue that's so bad they can't get out of bed, and
they call it long COVID.
They call it long COVID, but it's actually occurred after the vaccine, and what they are suffering from is a constellation of autoimmune syndromes, which just making their lives unbearable, requiring constant nursing. And I was going to say, just think of the cost of that. Just think of the cost, and it's all due to the vaccines. Now, another thing that really gets me is that when they started rolling the vaccine out, there was no need to. There was absolutely no need to. The big wave had gone. The people are going to die from it, who are always going to die from a wave. I mean, I've worked through 40 plus years, and I did a lot of general medicine in my time. We had the influenza wave. In the UK, 30, 40,000 people would die of a flu wave every winter, but they were all old people. They were going to die. It was just that thing that took them away. I believe COVID was actually no different.
Would you actually call it a pandemic?
No, I wouldn't. Well, it was a pandemic in the fact everyone around the world seemed to be affected by it. Yeah. But a pandemic that was serious, that required measures such as lockdown and vaccination, there's no way.
And that brings us to the question, what is the definition of a pandemic? It has been changed in 2009 by the World Health Organization, because before people had to die with great numbers, but they changed that definition by that it had to spread and everybody has to be infected. And it made it easier to roll out this whole process for the pandemic.
Yes, well, it's almost certainly, we have colds and flus that are rolled out with variations every year around the world, and you could loosely call those a pandemic. But a pandemic that needs WHO to get involved should be something that spreads, that kills over a third of the people that it infects. And there's no way at any time did the COVID get anywhere near that.
Ondernemer, dit wil je niet missen. MVO 2026 is uitgegroeid tot een uniek event voor wakkere ondernemers. Een dag waar strategie, vrijheid en toekomst samenkomen. De energie, die is nu al voelbaar. Ondernemers uit heel Nederland en daarbuiten hebben hun plek al verzekerd. En het gaat hard. Steeds meer mensen kiezen ervoor om te bouwen aan hun plan A, hun plan B en hun plan C. Hier of met het buitenland in gedachten. Op 12 juni komen ze samen tijdens MVO 2026 Prepare Today. Er zijn nog een paar plekken beschikbaar. En wil je erbij zijn? Ga naar mvo2026.nl en claim jouw ticket.
Do you think that the WHO has to change the definition then of a pandemic? Because they are allowed to call this a pandemic.
Well, I actually think that one thing I really agree with Donald Trump is the WHO is not fit for purpose. It should be completely disbanded. It's completely, utterly incompetent. Had it been remotely competent, that lab leak would never have escaped China. They interfered. China told them what to do. The handling of it was completely incompetent, and we should never have had it. Now, you could say, well, that's a mad speculation. Well, when they did a influenza pandemic coming from China review, the last government of Jeremy Hunt, etc., before Chris Whitty was the chief medical officer, Sally Davis was the chief medical officer, and she reported back, well, we've been assured that if it does occur in China, they would know how to deal with it, and there's no way it would affect us, so we don't need to worry very much. I mean, and do you know what? That was probably true. But then China strongly backed someone to take over the WHO that they could control. And that's the current guy, Tedros Ghebreyesus, if that's the right pronunciation. But it's remarkable that he is not a medical doctor and seems to be remarkably stupid in his pronouncements and the things he says about all sorts of things, and seems to have no understanding. There was somebody there who was called Dr. Nabarro, David Nabarro, who should have got that job, but they made sure, with the backing and the way the WHO was, that he didn't, because there's no way he'd allowed lockdowns. There's no way he would have allowed the vaccines. So there are big forces on high. Tedros is a useful puppet for them. And what the WHO seems to be very keen is to go along with what I call now the pharmaceutical industrial complex, to set the stage for pandemics to be rescued by new vaccines produced by this pandemic. Oh, by the way, we've got a new technology. It's called messenger RNA. We can basically fire it up so we have a vaccine in a few months. Now, that's another piece of naivety, because coronaviruses, the waves, don't even last 2 to 3 months it takes to do a vaccine and roll it out. And you know, one of the other papers we did, I worked with lots of different groups interested in immunology and, you know, proper vaccines, etc. And we decided that we would review the history of coronavirus vaccines. And it was really interesting. We had to, because of it was the start of suppression and censorship, etc., we had to produce this review under a title that suggested there was nothing of the sort in it. But it was fantastic.
Otherwise they wouldn't publish it.
Otherwise they wouldn't publish it, no. So, and when you actually saw the review, it's even more reason to believe that the people who are there, who allowed all this to go ahead, were guilty of either gross incompetence, negligence, or corruption. There's nothing else. They can choose some or both, but there's no other escape. Because if you review the coronavirus history, as my colleagues and I did in detail, it's been going on intensely for over 20 years. They're very keen on it in the veterinary world, let alone the human world. And what happens is the coronaviruses can never be vaccinated against. And I tell you why, for just very simple reasons. First of all, by the time they get the vaccine ready, however warp speed, remember they love this warp speed, the waves moved on. So your vaccine is against something that no longer exists.
You're already behind.
Already behind. But it's worse than that, because the vaccine induces an immune response that's entirely focused on something that doesn't exist. So when the new variant comes in behind it, it doesn't see the new variant. It thinks it's the old variant, and it shoots these antibodies up, which do not neutralize any of the new variants. But what it does, it binds the virus and enhances its infection. It's called antibody-dependent enhancement, which means that for every vaccine you give, you actually induce more useless antibodies that make you more likely to get infected. And we've seen this with the COVID boosters, which is another criminal. It is to even entertain these is criminally insane, because if you just look at the literature, it's full of basically, I would say, a brief thing from virology vaccines. If a vaccine needs a booster, it doesn't work. And if it needs another booster, you're wiping out your immune system that basically controls everything else, because it suppresses the T cell response. And that brings us right back, is what would I have done right at the beginning? I would have said we don't need a vaccine. We need things that completely boost the T cell response. And you know one, it's there are a lot of things out there very, very simple, but something over the counter, vitamin D, is the best booster for T cell response, other than some intervention like a vaccine booster or something like that. So we really didn't need all these things. So I'd just like to point out that the Cleveland Clinic published in its staff, which is the largest healthcare thing in America, that the more vaccines you had, the more likely you were to get COVID. And I was amazed that they didn't get, the censorship came in. Lovely graphs. If you have no vaccines, COVID, if you have one, if you have two, if you have 3, 4, every booster you have increases your chance of getting it, which is exactly the model that we looked at and predicted. So the whole idea of vaccinating against these, the only justification was commercial.
Angus, if this is true, and I assume you are the specialist here, why are people not yet arrested for what has been going on? Because this is serious.
It is unbelievably serious. And, you know, when I really did make a fuss, and I made a fuss even to the point of telling the cabinet about that all they need to do is make sure the really low levels of vitamin D in our population are increased. I calculated it would cost 40 to 50 million. Well, I think the cost of mismanagement of the COVID is already $1 trillion plus because of the long-term economic, the people who didn't get proper education, whose mental health was destroyed. And then we'll go on, I already mentioned the people who are no longer economically productive because they've had cardiac failure, there are all sorts of diseases they can no longer work. And this is all before we get to my observation on cancer, which is, I believe, is going to be a tsunami. No, we pointed all this out, and it's like one of the guys told me, he said, well, you're the only one. Now, if you're probably unaware, in Britain, we had an unbelievable thing with the post office. We had these post office submasters who run all the post offices in every village and town in England. And the government introduced this big computer system which they bought. And in no time at all, they were accusing all these postmasters of stealing money. The computer said that they were stealing money. So rather than look, if you realize there's an identical imprint going on here, rather than look at, is this computer accurate, they started prosecuting these people. And they started at 50, 70, in the hundreds. And then when people produced absolute evidence they couldn't have stolen, that it had to be a flaw of the computer, they were all told they were the only one. Well, eventually they got together and there was at least 700 of them who'd all been told they were the only one. Now, I was told I was the only one making this fuss about vitamin D and the way they were managing and the madness of the vaccines. I didn't believe that. And I've subsequently met several people. There tend to be professors of my generation who know a lot about vaccines and immunology. They all said the same thing.
Yeah, but you might not be the only one, but you were maybe one of the few who dared to speak out and to risk the career and your image.
Well, I didn't even think about this. But this was a crisis where they were really it's like turning the guns.
But a lot of doctors, medical doctors, were scared because they all had their mortgage. They didn't want to lose their jobs.
Yes, you could say that I was fortunate that I was past my sell-by date, and that at 70, that when this happened, I was still working. But I felt it was my job. Because I looked around me and I thought, you know, I am the only doctor that I'm aware of, and I was informed this, you forget these things, but I've actually been an NHS consultant, always honorary because an academic, but I've been an NHS consultant, honorary in general medicine, as a consultant for over 5 years. I've actually been a consultant virologist for 6 months to manage at the height of the HIV crisis, so I learned a lot about that. And I've been a consultant immunologist, just doing pure immunology as well as maintaining my primary interest in cancer. And so when I was appointed to the chair of oncology, actually I had this enormous experience, which none of the other oncologists has. And I felt that this gave me an insight into how you should manage things. And I was really, I was going to use the word disgusted, I can't think of a better word, of the way it was managed by people who claim to be experts, epidemiologists with mathematical modelling. The one that put us into lockdown, Neil Ferguson, I honestly think he should have been prosecuted for the damage he did, because lots and lots of us basically said this is a madness. By the way, this guy has got every prediction wrong. He has never, ever got a prediction. And if you do a modelling that says, if somebody has a virus that jumps to somebody else and you model 2, 4, 6, like that, you're obviously going to get horrendous figures. He said 500,000 would die in no time at all. But these people know anything about infections and pandemics, because it's incredible. All infections go in waves. They all peak and die out. And then you may have another 2 or 3 waves. Viruses somehow evolve. They don't want to kill everybody. I mean, it's not in their interest to kill all their hosts. So they attenuate. So you might get a bit ill, but they don't kill you. It increases their chance to jump to somebody else.
Sounds logical in a way.
Very logical. But this is the other thing, was the vaccines were told to be the cavalry that would save us, and that it would stop jumping, so it would kill the pandemic. By the time they introduced the vaccines, the pandemic, in my view, was over. They were trying to create all sorts of useless scares, different subtypes, delta types, things like that, and Omicron, which the South African came out. And to me, when I looked at the figures, and I've been to South Africa and I've been to the Cape Town institutes where they found Omicron and spoken to these people, I said, you know, if there was ever going to be a vaccine, Omicron was the ideal one. It's incredibly infectious, it spreads through the air, and it causes mild symptoms, doesn't kill anybody. What more could you wish for? And yet we were told this is a reason here by the half-wits in Britain that because of Omicron we need more vaccines. I mean, nothing could be... These people are unbelievably stupid, or they were driven by a higher force which I call evil. I really do. And one of the people I would call out, and I call out time and time again, is Tony Fauci. I cannot believe how nobody could be as stupid as him. So I think he's been captured with another agenda. I knew him, I met him very shortly after we published our Nature paper and CD4 receptor, and I went to all these meetings, by which time he was a very young head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And he desperately wanted to call the shots, kept giving big lectures everywhere. And I'll confess, I wasn't that quick or bright to pick this up. It took me at least 2 or 3 years before I started to question what he was saying. By this time, where's the vaccine, Tony? Sorry, you know, you promised 1984 that we'd have it in 18 months. You know, we're getting to the late 80s now and there's no sign of it. And then all these mechanisms for promotion and what have you of it, pushing the AZT on it. And I suddenly realized, wait a minute, we knew about AZT from oncology. It was so toxic, we wouldn't give it to leukemia patients. And here it is being promulgated for HIV. Anyhow, I really began to think these guys aren't particularly bright, or they've got an agenda. And I'm afraid I will leave it at that. And Ken Creedy, I think is the right name, published a book which sums all this up and encapsulates all my fears and everything I was concerned about. And he called it Fauci's First Fraud. It's worth looking at because it's the blueprint that he used for handling the COVID crisis too. And there's a very big blueprint there that was kind of like a dry run for COVID in many ways.
How were you treated in the UK when you spoke out? Because you are somebody with authority. I mean,
Yes.
You've been in this business for decades.
Yes.
As you explained also, your titles, your roles, your advisory boards. So when somebody like you speaks out, people should listen. What happened?
I was told to shut up, be quiet. I mean, it was unbelievable. When we discovered that the virus was genetically engineered and it had to be taken on board, otherwise the vaccines based on it would be a disaster, there was a directive in email from the principal at the time saying we weren't allowed to discuss it, that the University of London thought this was too sensitive. And words like saying it came from China is racist. I mean, they're so encompassed.
Are you serious?
I'm serious. They're so encompassed in woke. This is why the universities are collapsing and why they deserve to collapse, to be quite honestly. I just think there's far too many useless universities producing people. And when you get people...
The University of London wrote you an email that saying that the virus came from China is racist.
Yes, yes. And, well, that was one of the things that was said about it in the discussions that came about, you know, after it was released. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I've already sent papers off to say that it came from China, the Wuhan lab, but actually we also found while doing our research they could not have done it without Ralph Barrick from Carolina, and they could not have done it without funding from Fauci, which he always denied. But it wasn't difficult there because they put in the acknowledgements that it was funded by the Eco Health Alliance, DASAC now, a person deemed not fit for any government funding ever again, who thanked the money coming from Tony Fauci. So, I mean, how they can deny all this when it doesn't take more than half an hour to look through the literature, get the papers and see all this as well. But still, no, at any rate, this caused such a fury that Richard Dearlove got involved and looked at it, and he came out in total support of me. So after that, they stopped singling me out, but they just ignored me, and they wouldn't listen to anything that I said. I went on about the vitamin D and various other agents can boost your innate immune response. I said, this is a T-cell disease. The last thing you want is a vaccine that gives you antibodies, when we've published all the reasons why. No, but anyhow, moving on to the fact that when the boosters were rolled out, I noticed in the clinics, I was doing these melanoma clinics, within a sort of 6-week period, at the end of 2020 and 2021, that I had 6 patients with melanoma who had all relapsed, and that they had been completely disease-free for between 5 and 18 years. And I was really concerned about this, and so I really pummeled them as to any reasons here. They'd all been forced to have the boosters by the GP because they're at risk. And I realised that it had to be the vaccine. The only other reason is if you get supreme T-cell suppression because for 2 or 3 months it's been suppressed, and it's dreadful things in your life, like debt, death, bereavement, divorce, this sort of thing. None of them. They were all happy as Larry because they'd been disease-free for so long. So they had this and they were completely knocked out by it. So we had to start again the immune response, and in several of those, we got it back. We got control back with the immunotherapy. And that told me it was the T-cell that had been suppressed. And so I started to do some research on that, but in no time at all, there was a paper came out from Madrid. Some Spanish people, Fuentes was the first author, and the title said everything. It said T-cell exhaustion in SARS following the 3rd SARS-2 vaccine in cancer patients. It was unbelievable. I then went back and found that this is nothing new. If you have 3 vaccines of anything, you will suppress the immune response. Now, the people pushing the vaccine and the regulatory authority should all have known that. Anyhow, I started to see many, even in my social circle, I started to see people go down with cancer after the booster. But it got worse than that because other people started to contact me, actually from all over the world, whilst I was told by the directors at George's to shut up, and that these were just anecdotes, there was no proof. I'd have to do a big randomised study. I said, well, I don't know how we're going to do that, but happy to do with it. You'll not get funding. And then I said, well, probably could get funding. And you know what I was told? I won't tell you who it was, but it shows you the mindset, and said, if you get the funding, we'll make sure you don't get any ethical approval.
Wow.
And another person said to me, one of my colleagues, stop pointing this out. You're upsetting my patients. I said, what do you not understand? I'm trying to stop you killing them. I mean, it's that simple. How can you respond to some stupid thing like that? Well, it's been shown to be absolutely correct. We had a very brave surgeon up in the north of England who contacted me, and he said, I don't do melanoma, but I'm seeing the same thing in colorectal cancer. And he said, it's really quite amazing. In short, he said, colon cancer has been increasing for the last decade, and in younger people. We know that, and there's lots of reasons for it. Processed food, diet, and many other things, toxins, all sorts of things. There's no denying that. But he said what we've got is an inflection, a sudden increase in cases. He said before they're presenting stage 1, stage 2, I can cut them out. He said now we're getting them stage 3, stage 4. I can't cut them out because they got metastases. They're presenting metastases.
Is that the phenomenon that we call turbo cancers?
Turbo cancers, indeed. And they're presenting in younger people. And we're finding it harder and harder to treat them.
Wij staan voor een digitale wereld waarin privacy, veiligheid en vrijheid van meningsuiting de norm zijn. Vind jij dat ook belangrijk? Kom dan nu in actie en ontvang gratis de Pro-Privacy Checklist met bijna 100 praktische tips waarmee je vandaag nog je privacy kunt terugpakken. Ga naar proprivacy.io/checklist.
Did that exist, the turbo cancer phenomenon, before the
Nobody
outroll?
called it turbo cancer before. It's just that when you see so many of them and you're dealing with a clear situation, they coined the term turbo because as I said, there was something driving this. And then you got this inflection, rather like you're increasing the power of a car to make it go faster and faster, and you suddenly invent the turbo and it goes faster. That's how they were seeing it. That was their analogy for it. And looking back, I've seen many cases of so-called turbo cancers, but they're very individual, very rare. You don't see groups of them. You wouldn't say stage 1, 2, 3, 4 and turbo. We'd never have done that before. They were all too isolated and very odd and strange. And
so for you, working 40 years or more in oncology, you see a different phenomenon.
Yes. Well,
since the outroll of the vaccines.
Yes. Well, it's been tragic, as I mentioned, that I did not need to be doing a clinic to be aware of this. I was getting phoned up by friends and family, etc., saying, we know someone who's got this, that, and the other, what have you. And then one of my very good friends phoned up, and he said, yes, he said, I'm feeling really awful since the vaccine, the booster vaccine. And then I realized I had 3 friends who'd all had the booster vaccine against my advice. But they'd had them because they were told they couldn't travel unless they had a vaccine within a certain number of days, which meant the booster vaccines. And I had 3 of these friends, 2 of whom I spoke to, I know them very, very well. The other, I spoke to the family. All of them had the vaccines just so they could travel overseas for 70th, birthday celebrations, and one so we could travel overseas for his son to get married. Now, all these people had this booster to travel, and they felt awful after. The 2 I knew personally and spoke to, I said, it really looks like what they were describing. You're getting a kind of post-vaccine long COVID syndrome. You're feeling awful. This is exactly what the COVID syndrome was. And by that time, I knew that vaccines induced long COVID far more than COVID ever did. I mean, they tried to deny that. There's no doubt about that. And they got worse. And then, I mean, these were in parallel, these people, and they started getting bone pain. And I said, you've got to get scanned. We've got to see what's going on here, because long COVID doesn't cause bone pain, not like this. Anyhow, both of these people had explosive metastatic disease throughout their skeleton and in the hips. Both of them had to have hips done, what have you. One of them had myeloma. Sorry, yeah, he did have myeloma. The other one had melanoma, and that was the one I was asked with the consultant to help with the treatment. We made sure he had the very best treatment, immunotherapy, the bone treatment, everything. We might as well have just done holy water. The disease went through and killed him in no time at all.
And what was his age?
His age was exactly 72, 71, 72.
Is that common for people at that age, 72, to have a certain increase of the cells?
Well, at the level, no. It does happen.
Because as far as I know, elderly people don't increase cell production so fast.
That is quite right. That was something. This was like a fire went through his body. I mean, it was unbelievable. And the other thing is that if you have cancers that replicate quickly, they're often more susceptible to chemotherapy because they are replicating so quickly. Ironically, it's the slower ones that we have trouble with chemotherapy because there's always some going on that don't get killed. A very good example of this is some of the aggressive lymphomas who are completely cured with chemotherapy and now locked away with immunotherapy as well. Now, the other close friend had the same thing, but his diagnosis was myeloma, not melanoma. Myeloma is a cancer of the bone marrow. It's usually diagnosed on a random blood test or because people have vague symptoms and it takes a while. This guy basically presents with bone collapse, metastases everywhere, and has to have transplants, stem cell transplants everywhere. And he got a diary of that. The disease started the day, literally within hours of the third injection. So he never got, that's the irony, neither of these guys got to the very events they had the unnecessary vaccines for. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And the third guy actually went to his son's wedding, felt unwell, and he came back, it worked out, and he was diagnosed to have a lymphoma. Now, he had a lymphoma 10 years before, completely cured, as most of them are. And he'd not had any symptoms of relapse. I mean, it's forgotten about. So he goes back to his cancer doctor and says, I feel unwell. He says, your lymphoma's come back. And he said, why is that? He said, the oncologist says, and this is somebody I don't know. The oncologist said, have you had a booster vaccine, COVID vaccine? And he said, yes. He said, I'm afraid it is almost certainly that. I have seen so many cases relapse after they had the COVID vaccine. So people are aware of it, but they're not speaking out about it because they're being told to shut up and be quiet. The suppression of the damage that the vaccine's done is beyond belief, and I think it is criminal, absolute criminal. Unless, of course, you're in charge of a government and a health service where your number one goal is to reduce the population dependent on the NHS and pensions, etc. If that's your goal, you're doing quite well.
Who's benefiting from this? Because also Pfizer is probably getting trouble with it in the end. I mean, what agenda is being served here?
What agenda has been served is, I have no idea of it other than it's pure evil. And it comes from this idea that they have to have this medical industrial complex to keep people healthy. But it's ironic that the more vaccines and the more drugs for everything, the more unhealthy people have got. Robert Kennedy has pointed out we're more unhealthy now than they ever have been in the last 20 years. And it correlates beautifully with the number of vaccines, the number of people on long-term drugs. So I would just leave it at that.
Yes, but you mentioned the word evil a few times in this interview. Do you believe that companies like Pfizer are still working with the best intentions to keep people safe and healthy?
Actually, because I brought drugs into it, I lost my train with regards with the vaccines being introduced, and this comes from DARPA and the whole things that were set up, the sort of the deep state, that they needed to have vaccines for the next pandemic, like ostensibly to protect the military and then to protect the population, etc. And because of this, they required great big funding for this, and they also required the government to give funding to anybody involved so they'd have a complete identity on things. So this messenger RNA thing, which has been completely useless, even for treating cancer, and it never could get through that, they were so fixated, there was so much money given it, and Fauci was involved. in all this as sort of being in charge of a gene therapy, and it was a gene therapy. Until COVID required the messenger RNA for vaccines, a messenger RNA to be used as a vaccine, and it suddenly lost its gene therapy and became rewritten, acceptable, reclassified as a vaccine. Now, I regard all that, because it was all done in an emergency, I regard as extreme stupidity or evil. And yet it was all done. It was all approved. And if you read through everything, they knew right from day one that these vaccines did not work for infection. So why would you give it to a virus that only killed a few people, average age of 82? Why would you insist that everybody has to have it, even the children?
What's the answer for that?
There is no answer other than it's a fantastic market. I've spoken with people who've worked for Pfizer before, and I am horrified at the way they operate and what they do. We've all heard of Mike Yeadon, who's made, I won't go through that, he's been on there many times. But I've spoken to people who said, for Pfizer, who've been involved in work for Pfizer, and they've left because this conscience couldn't live with what they were doing. And one of the guys who'd been sort of similar level to myself in the company says, Pfizer aren't interested in cures, they're only interested in expanding markets. And that's probably, that fits the vaccine for COVID.
But if there's so many people get ill, if there's such a high excess mortality, and it was also destructive for their brand in the end.
Exactly.
So how can that be a good strategy?
Well, again, they don't think things through. Although other people have thought things through for them on the grounds that the vaccine's clearly causing a cancer increased incidence. I've talked about it suppresses the T-cell response, and then the input from the others, colorectal. Well, now it's everybody. I mean, the breasts, young women going down with breast cancer after boosters. There's just and I've got friends whose wives are going down with cancers after boosters. My friends don't have them because they've listened to me, but their wives listen to their GPs, who I believe are complicit in this organised assault, basically. It's grievous bodily harm. It is an assault because they know it will not do them any good. And I just cannot understand why they're continuing to do it. Interestingly, they get paid for each vaccine. They don't get paid any extra for a consultation or something that's useful, and so I'll leave it at that. But I am really horrified at the number of people getting cancer now. So my train of thought was, mentioning that, I point out that people are saying Pfizer buys up a company making new anti-cancer drug. Pfizer buys yet another company involved in the field of cancer, and implying that they're creating an expanding market. It is. I can only call that evil. I don't call that capitalism, because if you're in the healthcare industry, a lot of constraints seem to have been ignored. That you should have just pure humanity, morality seems to be completely ignored in all this. What for? Profits, power, manipulation. Why?
Talking about cancer and cancer treatments, there is this video going viral also about a Canadian physician that explains that there are some cancer treatments with products like ivermectin that have no patents. And of course they are suppressed as well. Let's just see what he has to say.
Cancer is no longer a death sentence. I'm Dr. William Mackis, a Canadian physician, board certified in nuclear medicine, radiology, and oncology. I run the world's largest ivermectin cancer clinic. Over the past 2 years, I've helped over 6,500 cancer patients with repurposed drugs like ivermectin, mebendazole, and fenbendazole. Chemotherapy can be very difficult on cancer patients, and some cancer patients really can't even handle chemotherapy. But those who can, they can really enhance their results by adding ivermectin. Over the past year, having treated over 6,000 cancer patients, there have been some incredible stories. We had a prostate cancer patient who was diagnosed with stage 4 everybody knew it was a terminal case. The patient got an appointment with an oncologist. The best they were going to get was a palliative chemo to give them maybe a couple of extra months of life. But in Canada at the same time, the patient also got an appointment for MAID, which stands for Medical Assistance in Dying. It's euthanasia. One of the family members got very upset at this and so started the patient on fenbendazole, which is almost identical to mebendazole. And then they added ivermectin to it as well. And after about 4 or 5 months, this patient that hadn't gone for their appointment for euthanasia became cancer-free. They went from stage 4 pancreatic cancer to being cancer-free. And so this was a life saved, and not just saved, but a patient who'd really beaten cancer. In January of this year, Mel Gibson was on Joe Rogan's podcast and started talking about some of his friends who had stage 4 cancer and who were really in bad shape.
I have 3 friends. All 3 of them had stage 4 cancer. All 3 of them don't have cancer right now at all. And they had some serious stuff going on.
And what did they take?
Jesus. They took some, what you've heard they've taken.
Ivermectin?
Fenbendazole.
Fenbendazole, yeah.
That's
I'm hearing that a lot.
They took those repurposed drugs and they're now cancer-free.
Angus, do you believe that these products work for cancer treatment?
Well, it's not a matter of belief. It's a matter of looking at evidence and being very cynical about it. And before it came out with these drugs, I was looking at repurposed drugs very much, which I think are incredibly important to cancer. And I will mention 2 of them because I was pushing them at the start of COVID, and we've shown that they are very, very useful in the COVID. And interestingly, they're both useful in cancer treatment. The first of this was a heat-killed mycobacterium, which is related to BCG, which interestingly we've known for a long time boosts the overall innate immune system. And the second one is low-dose naltrexone. And low-dose naltrexone is what it says on the tin. It's low doses of naltrexone, which is an anti-opiate drug. The last thing you would think that it would have a use in treating cancer and many other inflammatory diseases. Well, I was so interested in this, most of my colleagues brushed it off as smoke and mirrors and snake oil and things, but I saw patients clearly benefit from this. And I knew it was only that because I tried many others and I was surprised, the response rate. So I said, I want a mechanism. I'm a scientist, hopefully. I want a mechanism, and all the mechanisms do not explain this. So because I'd done the receptor for HIV, the CD4, I thought it has to be working through another receptor. It's not just the opiate receptor. So with very good immunological colleagues, we cast the net wide, and we found it inhibited a receptor called TLR9. You don't need to worry about what that is, but it's an inflammatory receptor. If you stimulate it, you produce all these inflammatory cytokines. One of them is called IL-6, interleukin-6. When it was discovered, it was called cancer growth factor. So here we discovered that this agent has to be working through blocking the inflammation, because we'd seen it helps in Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, fibromyalgia, and this would explain why it is so good, because no other anti-inflammatory works through this pathway. So I believe that this actually is a very, very important drug for cancer, and I would really want to see it pushed forward because it's non-toxic, low dose, cheap, works beautifully with everything except for opiates, because it clashes that. But if you don't need opiates, it seems to have no problem with anything else.
And it has no patent, so there's no interest by
There's no
big
interest
pharma.
in big pharma. I declare an interest. I patented these mechanisms of action in order to try and increase its chances of being taken up and used properly. Because without that, no one is going to pay for these ridiculous costs of trials to get these things approved.
Would you treat people with these products?
I do. It's not.
Is it allowed in the
Yes,
UK?
yes. Because once again, I'm allowed to repurpose drugs. And nobody can stop me that at the moment. They would probably try, but that is not allowed. Repurposed drugs, that is part of a doctor to say, it works for this inflammatory thing. You've got a lot of inflammation. Will it work for you?
It's like off-label use.
Off-label use, as we call it. And I got interested in many drugs like that, and we've researched a lot of them since. I won't go through them all, but relative to William Mackis and ivermectin and febendazole, mebendazole, I would say that none of that's news to me, because after the European Clinical Trial Directive came in, which basically was a directive to stop people like me doing creative things and to make it very difficult for small companies to challenge big pharma unless they were bought up. Essentially, it raised the barrier really high. And my academic research, I was doing cell-based research, we just couldn't afford the barrier. We had to have super clean laboratories that cost millions. Only big pharma could afford that. So basically, a big research project, I was doing dendritic cells and various ways to improve them and doing very well. It was fantastic, but suddenly stopped. I was told, if you continue, you'd be committing a crime, you'd be breaking the European rule, etc. I mean, I won't go into that now. But because of this, and I couldn't treat my patients with this, I became aware that in Germany they could. And in German doctors, because of this, virtually what I now call the magisterial code, which actually is applicable to the whole of Europe. It's just that we didn't know that at the time. But the German doctors were basically doing all sorts of things that I would do, but I wasn't allowed to do. So they asked me to go along to their meetings, got very friendly, really liked them. And so all forms of alternative repurposing was being done. And I thought this is the way to go. And I mean, I really enjoyed it.
But this is something that everybody should know. If there is a cancer treatment that really works and it's so cheap and easy, and it doesn't demolish your body like what these chemotherapies mostly do.
Yeah, but this is the point.
Everybody should know this.
They should. They allow it to occur, but they pretend it doesn't exist from the insurance and the medical services, etc. They kind of ignore it. But my point was that in one of these meetings, we had well, not one. I mean, we had regular people who actually gave small little studies showing that people who had chemo-resistant cancer responded to drugs directed at worms and filaria and things like that. And they would show us, you know, they were anecdotes, they weren't big trials, but there was clear evidence, drug, cancer regressing, going. What were these drugs? They were ivermectin, febendazole, mebendazole, and others. I can't remember for now, but it's exactly the same as William Mackis is doing now. And the good news is William Mackis is basically being forced out of Canada by the police, and all sorts of things. You know, they made him a criminal there. But the good news is that Florida and Lepardo have opened up to research this. So he's now been given a license in Florida. There's a massive budget to research these drugs now for cancer. So that is the good news. Hopefully we will get some really hard information, because at the end of the day, it's been lots of very, very good...
They're doing some clinical trials now.
They're very good anecdotes. But I and others have looked at the ivermectin, and it has all the hallmarks of being a very good anti-cancer agent.
If somebody's watching and suffering maybe a cancer disease at the moment, or has relatives with cancer, what can they do? What would you advise?
Well, all I can advise is that, I mean, that a lot of standard treatments are very good and they work. If it's clear that they've been told that they've just got a treatment and it's got a 40% success rate, but that you might as well put up with, just be aware there are an awful lot of things out there that the authorities basically just don't recognize, and they don't want you to know. A lot of my patients who I've encouraged to go on these things, we have to say, the big question is, do I tell my doctor treating me with this drug that's unlikely to cure me, do I tell them or not? I mean, this is the big issue.
But probably they will go to a doctor and to the oncology section in the hospital, and they will be told the regular things like chemotherapy.
Yes,
and all
they will be. And when
Is it wise to do that, to go that way?
Well, it depends on the cancer, depends on the patient, depends on everything else. I mean, it's very hard if you've got a very effective treatment to tell people to do anything other, even if it is a bit toxic, if it's got a high chance of curing them. What I'm talking about is the patients who are receiving treatments that have a low chance of curing them, and they just feel exhausted, toxic with it. Is it worth their while trying these other things? Well, when these other things are quite easily available, very hard to get on script, ivermectin. I'm sure that is Big Pharma interfering with it, but they're very easy to get from a variety of sources, internationally, all sorts. I know plenty of people who get these very easily. Mebendazole's available in scripts, repurposed drug, that's not a problem. And people get febendazole without going through the script very easily.
But we don't want people to go and experiment themselves. So
no, I think it needs some guidance, because I don't know anybody who fully understands what is best. But the fact we get some anecdotes where the cancer disappears totally unexpectedly, and they're on these regimens, and they've been told that their chances of the treatment they had is pretty low, and yet that's what keeps us going.
But is there a European portal where people can go to have some information about how they can be treated in these alternative ways in Europe, in Germany, in the Netherlands, or the UK, or whatever?
Well, there are international websites. Basically, a whole range of people are discussing these and giving advice, what have you. It's actually encouraging doctors to incorporate them into their clinics, which the problem I have is like a patient who I put on low-dose naltrexone, who had a terrible prognosis. Basically, she had liver metastasis from a condition that usually kills you in less than a year. And she came to me and I put her on this low-dose naltrexone and boosted the immune response. And she had a very good response outcome. And she went back to her main doctor to say, I'm actually doing really well. And I said, what did he say? My God, are you still here? He says, that's the first thing. And then he said, what are you taking? And she said, well, I was exploring other mechanisms, and Prof. Dalglish has put me on low-dose naltrexone here, and everything's settled down and I feel really good, and it's 2 years out. You said I'd be dead a year ago. And he said, what did he put you on? And she said, low-dose naltrexone. He said, it's not allowed, it's not approved, it's likely to be highly toxic, and you must stop it immediately. So I said, what did you tell to him? She said, I looked him in the eye, smiled and said, do you think I'm an idiot? And she didn't go back to him again. But that's the sort of attitude that's been ingrained. That should have been like me. I learned about low-dose naltrexone because I said to this patient, it's fantastic, you're doing so well. And I'll be honest, I thought we'd be relapsing because you're at a very bad stage. You must be taking more than I've given you. That was what I concluded that. She denied it, but I turned out to be right. She was taking low-dose naltrexone from a doctor in America. And that's how I learned about it. And I was very receptive. Anything that helps, this is what we got to look at. And so I'm desperate for someone to do a proper trial of low-dose naltrexone in cancer. I wrote a big review with my colleague Wei Lu, who does all my lab work, and myself, and the role of LDN in the management of cancer. And it explains just why it is such a good agent. And I was over the moon when I saw recently there's a group from Poland have published a thing saying that the LDN is an ideal adjuvant for chemotherapy in the management of cancer. And I thought, that's fantastic. Another group completely agrees. So that increases our chances of getting someone to do this. Now, we have been in talks with the NIH and Maha because they have publicly proclaimed they're going all for this. And I'm hoping that if we don't get any traction here, that Robert Kennedy particularly is very keen on this. The low-dose naltrexone and the heat-killed mycobacterium agents that we have, which are so easy to give and zero toxicity apart from little local reactions, etc. But every trial has been positive, but they're all deemed as not big enough to be approved. Well, hopefully they've made noises that they're not going to allow that, because the whole system's set up that the only people who can get anything approved are the real big pharma, who control the whole thing. And Robert Kennedy's woken up to that. And Jay Bhattacharya, the new head of the NIH, is aware of that. So we are hoping we might be able to get traction on that. And the same thing goes for the ivermectin mebendazole story too.
It was really interesting and good to talk to you. And I'm honored and thankful that you came all the way from the UK to this beautiful place in Edam in Holland to share your knowledge with us and with the viewers. If you found it interesting to watch, and if you think it's important that other people see it, share this video with as many people as possible. It's good for yourself and of course for the growth of our network, our channel, lighthousetv.nl. And if you think it's good what we're doing and you want to support us, you can give us maybe a small donation to support our work. You can see the website down below. It helps us to keep on going on with spreading the truth and important information like we shared today. Thanks, Angus, and have a safe trip back home.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Dit programma is mede mogelijk gemaakt door Bundel, ITAR Innovative Technology, Real-Root Supplements, Pro-Privacy, Goud 999 en MVO 2026. Prepare today.